Hi, all, and welcome to Lesson 7. Looking forward to discussing some more readings with you. So, this is going to be Fiction 2, as you can see there, and our second, obviously, foray into the study of fiction as a genre. We've covered Drama 2, Poetry 2, which was dramatic poetry, and then Rhetoric 2. So, what we have left is Fiction 2. And then in lessons 8 and 9, we'll cover the third and final foray into each of those genres. So, Fiction 2, we have 20th century short stories. This is going to be one of my favorite lessons because I think these are two of the all-time, both in my top 5, greatest stories. Why have I chosen them beyond that reason, and how do they fit into our study chronologically? Fiction is honestly the easiest and funnest of these genres to teach because it's the most straightforward and that it's the most popular today, right? What people read most are novels, which are an example of fiction. I've mentioned before how fiction, even though there were a few novels published before the mid-19th century, really rose to prominence in the mid-19th century when the middle and working classes became educated, more of the people from them in the U.S. and Europe, particularly England and the U.S., and they wanted to read fiction. They didn't want to read poetry as much as the upper class, and now that they could read fiction, they didn't have to go to the theater for entertainment, so they could read for entertainment. And they really liked short stories and novels. And so last time we studied fiction, we studied Hawthorne and Poe because they were two of the first short story writers. And in a class like this where we're studying so many genres, we don't have time to read a novel, though I wish we did. So our study of fiction is primarily short fiction, primarily short stories, though in Lesson 9, when we do Fiction 3, we will read a novella, which is, a little bit longer than a story, but much shorter than a novel. And so we started with Hawthorne and Poe because they were two of the very first short fiction writers and really kind of pioneered the genre. Where do we go for Fiction 2 then? Well, we jump ahead a little less than 100 years to the middle of the 20th century, and we look at two of the most well-known, prominent, and excellent short fiction writers of the 20th century, William Faulkner and James Baldwin, both two of my personal favorites. So I've chosen these stories and chosen this period of time because with fiction, it's not like drama, where with drama you had, Sophocles and his contemporaries invented it essentially in ancient Athens, and then you have this huge global impact on the genre of drama in the form of William Shakespeare and the Renaissance. You don't have the same kind of evolutionary threads with fiction. It had been around, didn't rise to prominence till the middle of the 19th century. So the middle of the 19th century is the place to start, which we did with Poe and Hawthorne. But then it just becomes more popular, and the novel becomes more popular, and it becomes mainstream with things like genre writing. But we already talked about the overlap with genre fiction a little bit in the Poe lesson. So there's not really another big development. It just becomes more and more popular over the last 200 years. And so rather than picking kind of the next epoch or paradigm shift, I'm just going ahead about 100 years and looking at stories that is similar to how Hawthorne and Poe encapsulated the concerns of the day in the 19th century, two stories that encapsulate the concerns of the day in mid-20th century U.S. And so U.S. history, things that have been formative to U.S. history, such as slavery and race relations, play a huge role in these readings. And so what I'm hoping these readings will do is really show to you the power of fiction, how it can engage with the society from which it emerges, and comment on that society and teach us universal truths. And I think these stories really do that. So being a university that's located in the U.S., probably most of you are from the U.S. who are taking this class, we'll really get to see how these stories engage with our culture and engage with it, I think, and the stories are tragic in many ways, but the ways in which they engage with our culture are productive. And so hopefully they'll just show you the power of fiction. But what's nice about this lesson is I don't have to teach you what dramatic poetry is, because you know what fiction is and you know how it works. You know protagonist, antagonist, narrative arc, climax, resolution, denouement, etc. So we can just dive right in. Faulkner's Barn Burning. This is a powerful, challenging, one of the most complex short stories I've ever read. And it really asks some big questions. And it engages with what is arguably the darkest and most wicked part of our country's history in an incredibly impactful, productive way. But anyone, even if they're not from the US, I think could really get something out of this story because it asks some big, significant questions. But, one of those questions has to do with the nature of evil. And are characters in this story evil or not? And so that's why I've chosen this picture. So I'd like you to just kind of look at this picture, soak it up for a minute, and meditate on it, and see what emerges. And keep it in your mind as we go through the discussion. Got a little bit about Faulkner himself. He was one of the most prominent American modernists, perhaps the most influential and widely recognized American modernist today. And by American there I mean from the U.S. It just sounds awkward to use U.S. as an adjective. But what is modernism? I'm not going to try to teach it in this lesson because it would just be too much to cover. But in the last lesson when we studied Tennyson, I felt I did a good job of breaking down the different periods, moving from the Enlightenment, which emphasized logic, to the Romantics, which emphasized emotion, to the Victorians, who emphasized duty. Now we're to the modernists, who really emphasized individuality, psychology, and literary technique, the power of the art itself, which is why this story is told in kind of a convoluted way, even though the essential plot is very straightforward. And so modernism was an experimental genre or experimental literary movement in the early to mid 20th century that used complex art as a way to grapple with the changes of the modern world. And Faulkner be the preeminent modernist in the U.S. But his literary recognition was posthumous because he had little financial success as a writer during his lifetime, and he had to do things like write screenplays for Hollywood movies just to pay the bills, kind of like how Poe wrote, reviews to pay the bills. But nowadays, we consider these to be Poe, Faulkner, etc., some of the greatest writers of all time. And the Southern setting looms over all of Faulkner's work. I think in this day and age, the issues we face today as a society, Faulkner is one of the most important authors for us to read. And the history, the complex history, which is not just, can't just be reduced to one single understanding of it. The complex history of the Southern U.S. is so relevant and bears so thoroughly on today's world, and we need to read Faulkner. The Southern Renaissance was a period in the early to mid 20th century when literature, particularly fiction, and I would add particularly short fiction, flourished in the southern United States. And so the term Renaissance is a little misleading because it refers to a rebirth. This is more of just a birth rather than a rebirth. But the Renaissance period in England, when there was a rebirth of the classics, that was Shakespeare's time. It was seen by scholars as such a just prominent, productive period for literature that now the term Renaissance, more so than rebirth, has come to mean just a period of great productivity. And so there hadn't really been a literature, if you will, of the southern U.S. before the mid-20th century, but writers like Faulkner, O'Connor, Weltley just started cranking out really great stories in the middle of the 20th century, and so people called it the Southern Renaissance. And I said short fiction at the beginning of the lecture, I said, hasn't really had kind of the same evolution of with these different epochs that influenced it. If there's a moment in the history of short fiction that's as influential as its birth, or comes close to being as influential as its birth, with Poe and Hawthorne, the next probably most influential period is this mid-20th century period, particularly the Southern Renaissance, and then, as we'll see with James Baldwin, what we call the Harlem Renaissance, for the same reason, just this huge outpouring of literary development. Although the Harlem Renaissance was known more for poetry than fiction, although it did have great fiction, and a lot of the the African American writers were from the South, who became big influential voices in the Harlem Renaissance. And so the Southern Renaissance is probably the most influential period of short fiction writing outside of its genesis 100 years earlier with Hawthorne and Poe. A little bit more on Faulkner himself. Yoknapatawpata County, what? It's a sprawling fictional Mississippi county full of recurring characters who appear in multiple works of Faulkner's and thus help create a rich history and mythology. So you have like the Snopes family, for instance. One of our two main characters here is Abner Snopes, the father in the story. He's got relatives. Other members of the Snopes family appear all throughout Faulkner's writing, and that's a really common theme. So Faulkner is really, for a guy who's writing fiction, just kind of general fiction rather than, say, epic fantasy, he's really into the concept of world building and builds quite a world here. Like all secondary worlds in literature, Faulkner's secondary world really resembles a primary world, but even more so. He wants these recurring characters to just give it this sense of mythology, but at the same time, it's so real. It's so vividly real. You just change the names and it becomes the Southern U.S. That's part of the power and the complexity of Faulkner's writing. Finally, obviously, the post-Civil War South is of the utmost importance here. Faulkner and other Southern Renaissance and really Harlem Renaissance writers like Baldwin grappled with the aftermath of the Civil War and the effects of Reconstruction on the Southern U.S. So this is a complex period. You're dealing with, the end of the Civil War. In theory, the end of slavery, and it didn't really end then. And even once the slaves were all technically officially emancipated, you still have, racism and Jim Crow and all kinds of awful things continuing on. At the same time, you have a culture whose economic system, if you will, was entirely based on slavery, and that goes away. So it's just a huge upheaval for everyone in the South, with people who were once part of the upper class, slave owners, are now, they have no place, no function in society. The economy collapses. The government tries to send in help to deal with the collapsing economy. That's called Reconstruction, but it actually is not very helpful. It's further problematic. And then you have people like many of Faulkner's main characters and Faulkner himself who were like coming out of that culture, or in some cases, some of the characters are actually people whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents owned slaves. And so there's a legacy there, but they're not owning slaves. They're not contributing to that, but their family history did. What do you make of all that? How do you exist in that culture? And that's hugely complex, psychologically, spiritually, etc. And so Faulkner, the brilliance of his writing is the nuanced way he engages with all of that. He's not simply just, condemning people because their ancestors owned slaves, but at the same time, he's showing the complexity of the African American experience, even though he wasn't African American himself, in the post-Civil War South. So he just engages with it, all of it, in such a nuanced way. He's got so much to offer to us in this sense. So that was Faulkner in a nutshell. Things we'll study in this story. I think one idea that has to frame this story is the idea of good versus evil, because you have a clear battle between Sardi and Abner. And you have a question of, is it a battle of good versus evil, or is it something else? I said this story meditates on the nature of evil. And in addition to all the themes I've mentioned so far, this theme is particularly important today as we face, similar issues, right? Racism, not ended. Unfortunately, very much alive, and we have to face it. So how does a story that was, also dealing with racism, written 100 years ago, or not quite that, 80 years ago, but how does it help us today engage with the issues we're facing today? But the core here is this question of good versus evil, because racism is undoubtedly completely 100 plus, 110%, 1,000% evil. So what do we do with it? How do we fight it? Can we even destroy it? Can we live in a world without evil? Is there such a thing? This story asks us to meditate on those things, because it asks us, is Abner evil? If he is, what does it mean, Sardi's choices in the story? But there are even ways to read this story, which we'll talk about in a minute, where when I've taught this before, I was challenged by students, and I've reevaluated not what I believe about the story, but the way I teach it, because students challenged me and said, what if Abner is the protagonist? What if Sardi is the villain, which just, completely blows up our understanding of the story. So asking, is Abner evil? What do we do with the nature of evil? It's a conversation we have to have all throughout human history, but especially so in today's world. Another important thread or aspect of the story here is individual versus community, because Abner says over and over again, you got to stick to your blood. And he's created a family unit that, with the exception of Sardi, basically obeys him and follows his lead. Problematic and wicked as his choices and actions are. But community is a good thing, right? We need other people. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that isolation is bad for the human soul. And Sardi does something that he believes is for the greater good, but he gives up his place in a community. And Abner says, that's what will happen if you defy me. And so what Abner says will happen does indeed happen. But is it for the greater good? The story also asks us to ask that very important question. And as you see, these are all threads here framed as something versus something, because this is a story that Faulkner very intentionally sets up as Sardi and Abner. And so everything kind of follows along there with them. So it's pairs of things. And Faulkner is challenging us to think about these binaries in complex ways. So the final one is higher morality versus tribal morality. You got to stick to your blood. That's tribal morality. Higher morality is a more universal kind of morality. For instance, like thou shalt not kill. Or just more generally, like higher morality is a belief that there are some things, for instance, like murder or rape or something that you just don't do. That no matter what you believe, no matter what culture or background you're from, there are some universal things that, no matter the context, are wrong. That's what Sardi believes. He believes his dad burning barns is wrong, regardless of the context. His dad is a moral relativist. He says, no, this is your family. We've been mistreated. We've been oppressed. That gives me the right to burn barns. You've got to help me. You can't testify against me. You can't warn people. You can't stop me. So kind of like universal morality versus relative morality would just be kind of a synonym, another way to frame that question. And so in today's culture, does evil exist? Is it better to be part of a community or completely, an individual outside a community? Is a universal morality or more relative morality? Which of these are better? Which of these are more helpful, more productive? This story demands we ask those questions in the way it sets up Sardi and Abner in conflict with each other, in opposition to each other, and also what we think about who's the hero, who's the villain, helps determine how we answer these questions, how we see these binary relations. So that's my first question, is who is the protagonist of the story and who is the antagonist? Now you might be thinking that it's probably Sardi, right? That seems like the obvious choice. We follow him. It's mostly from his perspective. He seems to make the decision for the greater moral good. That's what I've always believed, and I still believe that. But I had students challenge me on this point in a class discussion that was a very good discussion. They said, what if Abner is the protagonist? And like I said a minute ago, in that moment, my mind blown. So I've reread this story. I've worked through it since then. I still personally think Sardi is the protagonist. But like I've said over and over and over again in this class, I'm going to share my personal beliefs with you because I'm a cards on the table kind of a person. But that doesn't mean you need to agree. Some teachers grade that way. I don't. There are no bad arguments in this class, just poorly defended arguments. And while I disagree with the argument that Abner is the protagonist, it is, I would say, a defensible argument if you do a good job of making it. Now, it's a hard argument to make, but you can make it. So what I'm going to do on this slide is show you how we could see Sardi as the protagonist, which will be fairly obvious, and how less obvious you can see Abner as the protagonist, so that you can more informed make your own decision, and then when you get to the discussion board, see how you answer the questions based on that. So one thing that's helpful, I think, to understanding how both of these characters could be considered the protagonist by readers is the basic kind of narrative structure I mentioned on the first slide that you don't necessarily get in other genres, but that you always get in fiction, which is a protagonist is a main character with a goal. An antagonist is someone who tries to prevent that goal. So the action of the story is plays out when the main character or the protagonist and the antagonist come into conflict, and then you have the climax, which is like their final battle, and then the resolution is what happens, who wins, does the protagonist achieve their goal or not. And then you have denouement, which is open or closed, how ambiguous or is the ending of the story. So when you think about it this way, Sardi has a goal, right? To stop his father, to stand up for the greater good. Abner's obviously trying to stop him, and there's clearly a confrontation, a battle here when Abner tries to burn Despain's barn, and Sardi warns Despain, and then a resolution where Sardi has achieved the greater good. He's helped Despain, but he's completely cut off from his family as the result of that. But Abner also has a goal, right? He wants to burn barns, and Sardi's clearly trying to get in the way of that. So in that sense, you could also potentially frame Abner as the antagonist of the story. But let's look at some quotes that support this. For support of Sardi as protagonist, watching him, the boy remarked the absolutely undeviating course which his father held, and saw the stiff foot come squarely down on a pile of fresh droppings, where a horse had stood in the drive, and which his father could have avoided by a simple change of stride. And so a couple of words that are really important here. Stiff, which is repeated a lot throughout the story, and then also the idea that his father is absolutely undeviating here, and especially that the manure he could have avoided with a simple change of stride. That contrast between absolutely undeviating and stiff, the contrast of that with simple here shows that it's so intentional. His father is trying to antagonize Despain, right? You could potentially argue that the barn burning is a response, kind of an emotional outburst by Abner in response to like the legal proceedings with Despain and how those unfold. But we know that Abner has burned barns before. And so here we see his process. He's provoking Despain, intentionally trying to irritate Despain. And then, the eventual result of that is his choosing to try to burn the barn. So we see the intentionality here. So we see the evil and wickedness of Abner very clearly in this passage. But like I said, some people, see Abner as the protagonist. So how do they reach that conclusion? Well, this quote is pivotal to their argument. He stood for a moment, planted stiffly on the stiff foot, looking back at the house. Pretty and white, ain't it? He said. That's sweat. Inward sweat. Maybe it ain't white enough yet to suit him. Maybe he wants to mix some white sweat with it. So what students and readers, scholars who argue that Abner is the protagonist argue is that Faulkner is taking Abner's character and metaphorically, keep in mind here, metaphorically, aligning him with the African Americans in the story by placing him in a position of oppression. How does he do this? How does Faulkner do that metaphorically? Primarily through the use of color. With Despain's house, that Abner wants to burn being this vivid, bright white, and Abner specifically saying here that slave labor makes the house white. And then he says maybe it's not white enough yet. Maybe he wants to mix white labor in with the slave labor. And so crucial to understanding this particular argument is that Abner and Sardi and their family are what we call tenant farmers, specifically itinerant or nomadic tenant farmers. So they'd travel around, from one job to another, and they'd be tenants. They'd live on someone's farm and for a time work on that farm. And that's, at the beginning of the story when Sardi's testifying, they have to leave that area because they don't have enough evidence to convict Abner, but everyone pretty much knows he burned this barn. So they say, get out of this country. So they move on and they take the job at Despain's. And so Abner sees himself as someone who had a higher position in society before the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, because of the way Reconstruction has ravaged the South, he's fallen from grace, and he no longer has a prominent place in society. He's forced, you could argue, by Reconstruction to be a tenant farmer, and he's arguing that these rich landowners who once owned slaves and still use and abuse African American labor are using them and abusing them, kind of like the way, not exactly, but kind of like the way they use African American labor and they use slaves before the war. So he's rhetorically, to make his argument, Abner is positioning himself as aligned with African American slaves and laborers who've been oppressed by white landowners. And Faulkner, then, students who make the argument that Abner's the protagonist, are saying that he, metaphorically aligns Abner that way. Now, Abner is a hard, difficult, challenging character with whom to have sympathy. But if we look at the story in this way, it is easier, even though he's a pretty wicked man, to have sympathy for him. And so in that sense, we can see how what he's doing, burning barns, is a way of lashing out at the oppression. The challenge with this interpretation is Abner himself, right? I find even his method here, his language here of aligning himself with slaves, saying what's happening to me is similar. I find that despicable and awful, because he's a criminal, he's a con artist. He was a con artist during the war who had no loyalty to anyone, no loyalty to either side, who just wanted to make money. I find it hard to accept the argument that he is someone who is oppressed and whose crimes are lashing out at that oppression. He's not an honest, hardworking person like the African Americans with whom he's associating himself here. So I struggle with the argument for those reasons. But like I said, there's no bad arguments, just poorly defended ones. And students who have defended this argument well have said Faulkner using the White House here and having Abner burn the White House is trying to make the point that, about how awful, slavery was, and how barn burning being an extreme response, it's almost understandable or justifiable in that context. So, like I said, I think it's a defensible argument. It's not one I agree with, and I think the character of Abner himself are the limitations for me in reaching that argument. But if you want to see Abner as the protagonist, you can do that. And who you choose to see as the protagonist, will inform where you go and the questions I pose on the discussion board. So I wanted to go over these passages and explain the logic of both those arguments so that you can make really informed discussion board posts. And I also want to address the use of the language here, which I did on the discussion board. Hopefully you saw that disclaimer before you read this story. What I'll just add is this literature reflects the culture of the day. As I mentioned, it's fierce with its reality. And I think that's a good thing. I think art should imitate life, but it's hard to read. We don't want to read these words. We don't want to say these words if we're reading the story aloud, and that's why I avoided them when I was reading the quote aloud, as helpful, as important as the quote is. But we also do not want to deny the reality of what happened, because it's important for us to try to do better today to understand what happened in the past. And so someone who fiercely gives us the reality, what Faulkner does, is very useful. And so we shouldn't ban books, or we shouldn't stop reading stories because of the language they use. What's important is not the language a story uses, but its treatment of its characters and of the language it uses. And so I think Faulkner is whether or not you think Sardi or Abner is the protagonist, no matter which way you view the story, one thing that's clear, that's indisputable, that Faulkner is doing here is showing us the evil of language like this and the evil of racism and the evil of oppression. And he's showing that to us, and he's teaching it to us, and we have to read hard things to learn it, and we need to learn it. What we don't want to do is look at this story and say, yeah, Faulkner supports these things, because no, he's critiquing. Even if we see Sardi as the protagonist, he's still using this passage to critique Despain and to critique the culture that owns slaves and that still supports a system of racism even after the Civil War. He's critiquing, criticizing, condemning all of that. But you can't condemn something in a story without showing the horror, the wickedness of the evil of it to readers. It's not dissimilar from what Shakespeare does in Othello. And so I want to make clear why we're reading this and what the author's trying to do, because it's hard to read, and I'm challenging you and asking you to read it. But now that we have established how we could see Sardi as the protagonist and how we could see Abner as the protagonist, let's. And before I get to the discussion board, the last quote I want to look at has to do with the sacrifice Sardi makes at the end of the story. Because whether you believe Sardi is the protagonist or Abner is the protagonist, Sardi himself believes he made the right choice. But we see, what did he give up for that choice? He gave up his family. He gave up his only chance to belong to a community. And so, was it worth it? Was the juice a greater good, stopping the barn burning, worth the squeeze, losing your family, losing your community? He got up. He was a little stiff, but walking would cure that too, as it would the cold. And soon there would be the sun. He went on down the hill toward the dark woods, within which the liquid silver voices of the birds called unceasing, the rapid and urgent beating of the urgent inquiring heart of the late spring. He did not look back. All this quote really shows us is that Sardi is completely cut off from his family, his community at the end of the story, and then that he did not look back. Those are the two things it shows us. So he is unwavering here. I think the quote, he did not look back, and you can debate me here, and I welcome the debate, but I think it's indicating that Sardi is content with his choice, that he sees the juice is worth the squeeze, even though he's pretty much given up everything. But we might disagree. One thing about this story that is different from many of the other stories we'll read in this class is that a lot of the discussion board questions get into personal opinion. So when we transition to the discussion board in a minute, I want to encourage you to keep the conversation very civil and respectful. Some of us may see Sardi as the protagonist. Some of us may see Abner as the protagonist. We may really disagree on universal morality versus relative morality, on individual versus community, on good versus evil, etc. But let's disagree respectfully, because the university is the place. It's supposed to be the place where we do that, and we learn from each other by disagreeing in respectful ways. So I welcome disagreement. I welcome debate, as long as we're respectful as we do it. And so come at me, debate me here. But I'm saying that whether or not we agree with Sardi's choice, he agrees with it because he did not look back. But like I said, but before I made the disclaimer about respectful discussion board posts, is even if Sardi agrees with his choice, we may not, right? This discussion board is going to ask you to get more personal than you usually do. And the questions vary in the degree of how personal they are. So you can choose to answer one that's less personal if you want. But even if Sardi thinks standing up to his father was worth losing his family, we may not think that. And so I'm curious to see what you think. And that's why I just said the discussion board gets a little more personal this time. But what I would add here is he stood up. What I would add before we move on to the discussion board is he has stood up to evil. If you see Abner as evil, if you want to read Abner as sympathetic and as the protagonist, it's harder to see him as evil. But if we deny that Abner is evil, I mean, he's a character who's associated with the devil. So if there's whole articles, long articles including one in a textbook I used to use to teach this story, that explain how Faulkner has all this imagery in the story that associates Abner with the devil. So if we read Abner as sympathetic, we're having sympathy for the devil, to quote the Rolling Stones. And while I can see the point the Rolling Stones are trying to make in that song, I think the danger more so here is that if we deny that Abner is evil, we run the risk of being on a slippery slope. And where that slippery slope could lead us is to the denial of evil altogether. Context and circumstances matter. And in some situations, morality is different, right? Killing, we usually say, is not okay. But fighting in a war, right, is a context that would maybe make it okay. So there is such a thing as moral relativism. But if we pull on the thread of moral relativism, how far do we go? If we say Abner's not evil, if we say his context justifies his circumstances, or if we say his circumstances or his context, justifies his actions, does that lead us to eventually saying evil doesn't exist? If you can justify everything, if you can justify Abner's actions, can you justify everything? Can you justify slavery? If evil doesn't exist, is slavery and racism, are they evil? I think they are absolutely evil. But I think evil exists because I think Abner is evil. Now, I'm not saying if you think Abner is the protagonist that you think slavery is okay. Do not hear that here. All I'm saying is if we say someone like Abner is not evil, we run the risk of perhaps one day going too far down a road of moral relativism where we get to some of the potential conclusions I just mentioned. And so I think this story is a scathing critique of racism. I can see how some students think Abner is sympathetic lends to the scathing critique of slavery and racism, but I argue that Abner is evil, Sardi's choice, no matter the cost. I think community is very important. I speak to, in my own life and in my classes, I speak to the importance of being in community. As important as I think community is, I think Faulkner gives us an extreme situation where defeating evil, rejecting evil, saying this is wrong no matter the circumstances, is an extreme situation where giving up community is even more important. It's even more important than being in community because it means saying this evil is wrong. Because I think fundamental to the story's critique of racism and slavery is the understanding that evil exists, that a figure like Abner embodies evil, and we have to be able to look at something like slavery and racism, like Abner's actions, and say these things are evil if we have any hope of defeating them. So again, I believe that's what the story is about, but this story, probably more so than any other story we'll read all quarter, has the room for the debate and has the room for other opinions, and I earnestly look forward to hearing your opinions too. So what are some questions you could answer then to give your opinion? One is the protagonist-antagonist debate. Which do you see and why do you take that stance? And so if you want to not get as personal with your responses, this would be the question to answer. It's just who is the protagonist? Justify that stance from analysis of the text. The second question is essentially the same question, but phrased in a little more personal way. Readers often tend to interpret barn burning in one of two ways. Either one, Abner is evil, or at least his actions are evil, and Sardi makes a tremendous sacrifice for the greater good. Or two, Abner is a sympathetic villain whose methods are extreme, but whose point we see, and Sardi thus makes the wrong choice. Which interpretation do you prefer and why? So is Abner an evil that has to be stopped? Or is he someone who, even though he's extreme, and we may not agree with his actions, we at least see where he's coming from? But I think what's really important to consider with this question is what are the implications of that? And so it's kind of just another way of asking question one, but it asks you to render more of a judgment on the actions of Abner and on the actions of Sardi. Because if you think Abner is the protagonist, then Sardi's actions are, and Sardi's actions, no matter what, are also extreme. They are extreme. They're huge. He makes a huge choice. So this question asks you to render a little more of a judgment than the first one. So if you don't want to, get as personal with it, then go for number one. But that's why I essentially have the same question twice, because you're probably going to read those and be like, aren't they the same thing? But who you see as the protagonist informs the rest of the story, the rest of the questions, even though these next two questions are a little different. So the third one has to do with the two views of morality. Again, universal morality, something is wrong no matter what. Barn burning is wrong regardless of the context. And then relative morality, we can see why Abner is doing and Sardi was wrong to question him. And this question is very personal because it could essentially be like the same question in a third time. But the way this question is different is I ask, how has just reading this story, listening to this lecture, thinking about these things in the context of the story, how has that caused you to reflect on your own beliefs and values, perhaps, in new and insightful ways? So this is the most personal question. And so, that's why it's not the only question I ask. That's why I give you a choice of which one to ask. But it's essentially, the first three questions are essentially the same question, just phrased differently and you can pick, if you pick one of those three based on the degree of how deep you want to go personally with your answer. The fourth question is different. It's very related, but it's not exactly the same. Is the juice worth the squeeze? This one is a different question because the first three are basically all asking you, what do you think of this highly moral choice? Because based on your own morals, you may disagree or not with Sardi's choice, with Abner's choices. The fourth question actually asks you to kind of suspend what you believe about whether the choice was right, and to consider that Sardi thinks it was right. So in that case, is the juice worth the squeeze? If Sardi believes he was right, is it worth giving up community for that, what he sees as that greater good? Now, it's both personal and not personal. It's impersonal in that it's saying, except that Sardi believes he did what was right. But then it's personal in saying, if you believe that was right to the same degree that Sardi believes it, then hypothetically, would you think that greater good was worth giving up your family, giving up your community? It is a hard, difficult, but important question. It's essentially, what are we willing to give up for the greater moral good? In a way, siding with Abner asks, what are we willing to give up for the greater... Siding with Abner asks, what are we willing to give up for the sake of relative morality? Siding with Sardi asks, what are we willing to give up for universal morality? And those, what more important questions are there to ask? So this is why I think this story is so powerful, so important, even though it's a challenging story. And so now more than ever, I really look forward to reading your discussion board posts.